John Whittingdale to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell. And can I start by saying it is a real pleasure to be serving under your chairmanship and to be debating a subject which I seem to have spent a large part of my parliamentary career discussing, but which I think has actually become extremely appropriate to examine once again today. The Minister, of whom I've also spent a great deal of time debating over the last few years, last night replied to a German debate touching on the overall process under which the BBC Charter will be renewed. But as she said last night, and she's completely right, that the funding of the BBC is an absolutely central part of the Charter renewal process, and what the BBC does is obviously to some extent going to be affected by the money available to them and vice versa. So I do think it is right that we look at it. I had responsibility less than 10 years ago for drawing up the charter under which the BBC currently operate, but even though that was in sort of 2015-16, so about 7-8 years ago, the changes that have taken place since then in the broadcasting landscape are huge and continue to accelerate. So at the time of the last charter, streaming did exist, but it was only a couple of years after Netflix had launched in this country, and there were still only one or two other streamers available. Since then, we've seen an explosion. So there are an enormous number of different streaming platforms, and they are investing heavily in extremely good content, and most people in this country now enjoy streamed services as well as traditional broadcast and subscribe to quite often several streamers. Now, despite the huge range of content which is now available, in my view, and I think the government takes the same view, public service broadcasting is still absolutely necessary, particularly in the areas of news and current affairs, some of the core public service content which aren't really provided by the streaming services. So I do continue to believe that there is a very important role for the BBC in the broadcasting landscape of this country. But my concern is that the traditional method by which the BBC is funded through the licence fee is going to become steadily harder and harder to sustain. Even 7 or 8 years ago, we saw the beginning of the challenges. So at that time, the request of the BBC, we closed what was called the iPlayer loophole, by which people were viewing BBC content on the iPlayer, but not paying the licence fee. And we said at that time, and it remains the case, that if you watch live television in any form, but if you use the iPlayer, then you are required to have a TV licence. But it is, despite closing that, some of the other drivers which have increased revenue for the BBC over the years, like the growth of single-parent households, like the level of immigration, which meant more licences have been issued, that is now reversed. And we are seeing each year fewer people buying a television licence. So in the course of the last year, the number of licences held has fallen by 500,000 over 1 year. And that is likely to continue to do so. And if we look at the viewing behaviour of the public, and particularly young people, you will find that actually less and less broadcast traditional television is being watched by young people. Most 16 to 24-year-olds now do not watch any live broadcasts each week. 10 years ago, 80% did. And broadcast channels now only take up about 57% of all viewing, against TikTok, YouTube, and all the other streaming services. And so people are genuinely saying, we choose to subscribe and to pay for Netflix, for Amazon, for Discovery, for Apple, all the other streamers. We don't see why, on top of that, we should have to pay for a TV licence when we don't watch the BBC. And the TV licence doesn't just cover BBC, it covers all live television viewing, but nevertheless, a lot of people can watch on catch-up programmes available on the other public service channels. So genuinely, people are not required under the law to have a TV licence, and more are choosing not to do so. And that is going to pose an increasing problem for the BBC. We have seen complaints from the BBC over the fact that the available revenue to them has been cut over the recent years. Like every other public service, they've been required to find efficiencies. But the Director General has talked about the crisis that has been created by the lack of money, his inability to invest, to compete, and that is not likely to get any better if we continue with the licence fee. If anything, that is going to become steadily harder. Now, I remember chairing a select committee, I think about 15 years ago, where we looked at the funding of the BBC and the licence fee. And at that time, we concluded that whilst it had many drawbacks, it was still probably the best available option. It is a regressive tax. It is criminally enforced. It is the case that the number of people who are convicted of failing to pay, a large proportion are women. All of these are things which are drawbacks of the licence fee. But at the time, the alternatives do not seem possible. Certainly advertising is not likely to be beneficial either to the BBC, but also to the whole of the commercial television sector. There is not that much amount of advertising revenue, and if you have advertising on the BBC, it will result in a reduction for everybody else. The alternative option, which a lot of people have said, why can't the BBC charge a subscription so people can choose whether or not to pay it? And the reason is a simple one, that at the moment, most people still access the BBC and the other traditional broadcasters through Freeview, digital terrestrial television. And there is no mechanism under which you can have what is called conditional access. In other words, you can choose whether or not you wish to receive that particular channel with Freeview. That was something at the time of the launch of Freeview the BBC were very keen should be the case, because they were worried about subscription. But it does mean that whilst we continue to have a significant proportion of the population relying on Freeview, we cannot move to subscription. But that will change. The government, both the last government and this government, have said that we will maintain Freeview until 2034. It may well be we'll need to maintain it for a bit longer. But the transition to IPTV, the provision of television over the internet, is steadily going to increase. And if people have smart TVs, which allow them to choose whether to subscribe to the streamers, it means they could also then have the choice of whether or not to subscribe to the BBC. So I do think that that is an option which is likely to become more attractive, but is only really viable when we reach the point where almost the entire population has it available. But it is, for the reasons I've described, important that we start to talk about it now. The last government had a future funding of the BBC panel, which this government has not continued. But on the other hand, I know the Minister has set up the future distribution of TV panel, which doesn't look vastly different. But anyway, I'm glad that the government continue to look at this, which is why I think this is the right time to have this debate. There are certain things which will never be possible to have subscription-based. BBC Radio, there is no way, I think, in which you can have conditional access on radio. Equally, the World Service, which I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee and we're examining at the moment. The World Service is of huge benefit to this country. You couldn't have subscription. People it is aimed at are people who certainly are not in a position to pay money to receive it, and it is a very valuable contribution to the reputation of the UK and to our soft power ability. But the BBC have said in their view that it should be funded by the Foreign Office and not by the licence fee. That is something which I think is quite attractive, although I recognise that it would be a big challenge to take on, but the Minister gave evidence on this subject yesterday, and I think it remains an issue which we want to debate. Radio, you could extend advertising, but for the same reason it would damage commercial TV, and I'm actually slightly worried about the extent to which advertising is creeping in at the margin, with the BBC's allowing advertising to podcasts, which the more and more of the way in which people are accessing audio content. Of course I'll give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. I think he will recognise, as I do, that one of the big challenges in relation to the BBC is that if you encourage more commercialisation of the BBC, many of the people that are most opposed to that are the other public service broadcasters who worry about what that does to disrupt their own revenue streams, particularly in relation to advertising, and that is why it's very tricky to come up with an alternative to the licence fee.
My right honourable friend is, of course, completely right, and I mean, she and I both had the pleasure of serving as ministers. I was delighted to stand in for her while she was on maternity leave. So we have both been looking at this for some time. And of course, she's absolutely right. We have to look at the overall television landscape. And if you allow advertising or encourage the BBC to compete, that is likely to have an impact on the commercial sector, who do depend completely on advertising revenue, and our traditional advertising-funded PSBs, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, are already finding it difficult in a world competition with very well-resourced streamers, and this would make it even worse. Of course.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful, Chancellor, gentlemen. One of the weaknesses of the streaming companies is in regional and national news coverage and programming. Now, for BBC Scotland at the moment, 99% of the licence fee paid by Scots is actually invested in Scotland. Is this not a really important, positive aspect of the current licence fee arrangements and must be protected as we move forward?
Well, I have sympathy with the honourable gentleman. It is the case that the core public service content, which the BBC provides, more than the other PSBs do, but not to the same extent, and national and regional coverage of the type he has described is absolutely a core part of that. And I think that needs to continue. And if the licence fee is not able to fund it, then there is a case for it moving across to general taxation. So I think the world in which the core PSB content is funded out of taxation, and then the content which is more entertainment-based and people could choose to subscribe to, we might look to go to a subscription model. But it is too early to say. These are the kinds of discussions which are absolutely fundamental to the next charter. I'm delighted that the government is now beginning to consider that, and my purpose today is actually to flag up the extent to which this existing model, in my view, cannot be sustained, and to begin having the debate. Of course, I'll quickly give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Following the recent developments in Syria, I understand that BBC World Service, which he referred to earlier, will offer enhanced services to audiences across the country in Syria on broadcast, medium wave and FM. Would he agree with me and congratulate the World Service on actually stepping in to respond to an emergency situation with the utmost professionalism? And doesn't this underline his point about why it should be funded from the Foreign Office?
I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I do agree with him. I mean, we listened to and took evidence yesterday from the Director General and the Deputy Director for News, Jonathan Munro, on this exact subject. And he was talking about the way in which the World Service does provide its core language services, but then can provide additional coverage very quickly, and Syria is a very good example of where they are doing that. That is an extremely important role of the BBC. It is one which I cannot see can be funded any other way other than through public money, and I think the BBC do make a good case as to why the licence fee may no longer be appropriate, and that too we need to consider. But there are a large number of members present. I don't want to take up any more time. I hope that I've just managed to raise one or two questions which I think we will need to debate quite thoroughly over the course of the couple of years which lie ahead for the Charter renewal.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. I don't intend to set a fixed time limit at this stage, but if members could stick to about 5 or 6 minutes, we should be able to get everybody in. The question is that this House has considered the future funding of the BBC. Tom Rutland.
To serve under your chairmanship, Mr Mundell, and I refer colleagues to my register of interest as the chair of the BBC APPG, a recipient of hospitality and a former employee of the Prospect and Bec2 unions, which represent workers at the BBC. Thank you to the Right Honourable Member for Maldon for bringing about this debate on what is such an important issue, not only for the BBC as an organisation, but for all of us who benefit from it delivering its mission to inform, educate and entertain. When we discuss the future funding of the BBC, we must understand the need to safeguard its unique role with a funding model that enables it to continue being independent, universal, and providing the unique content its audience expects. With BBC iPlayer being the fastest growing streaming service this year and 95% of UK adults using BBC services every month, whether that's their 9 TV channels, 16 radio stations, streaming apps, or the World Service, we must recognise, I think, that the demand for the BBC's services and content reflects just what a vital source of information and entertainment it is for our constituents and those accessing World Service content around the world. But, colleagues, it's also vital to our democracy. Amongst a landscape of bias, spin, and sometimes a don't let facts get in the way of a good story approach taken by many, and the rise of unverified content and disinformation masquerading as news on social media, the BBC championing impartial and fearless reporting at home and abroad and operating without pandering to political or commercial interests is becoming more vital, not less, and I'm sure colleagues of all political persuasions would agree with that. Mr Chairman, the financial challenges for the BBC are stark, and when we debate future funding, we must recognise this as already set out. It's seen a 30% real terms decrease in funding for UK services in the last decade, exacerbated by previous decisions around the licence fee and, of course, the hyperinflation that's been taking place in the film and TV industries in recent years. And they've also taken on additional financial responsibilities in the past decade, including licences for the over 75s on pension credit. And while I know the BBC welcomes the new government's funding uplift for the World Service in our recent budget, 2/3 of its funding still comes from the licence fee. And while I know that the licence fee will be in place until at least 27-28, given the challenges outlined, this Westminster Hall debate on future funding is very timely. Many funding models have been proposed, but many of the licence fee alternatives simply would not secure the future of our world-leading public service broadcaster and would threaten its ability to create uniquely British content and tell stories, both fictional and real, from across the UK. An advertising model, for example, would not be right for the BBC. It would introduce commercial interests into programming decisions and force the BBC to compete with other public service broadcasters and commercial radio and TV over ever-dwindling advertising revenue, as the Right Honourable Member pointed out. And I would be deeply concerned by the impact that this would have on the BBC's ability to continue investing in our world-leading creative industries and talent. And I believe it would undoubtedly leave the BBC and the rest of our broadcasting ecosystem worse off. Similarly, a subscription model would not provide the universal public service broadcasting that I think we and the BBC aspire to, and similarly threaten regional programming and investment. So, colleagues, it's unsurprising that the government has committed to a sustainable public funding model for the BBC as part of the upcoming Charter review in order to ensure that we continue to have a BBC that is impartial, universal and accessible. But it is important that we closely examine the licence fee model and consider reforms to ensure that its scope, progression and enforcement are fit for the times we find ourselves in. We have something very special in the BBC. It's brought the nation together for over a century for those enormous moments in our shared lives, from sporting triumph to election drama, which we all enjoyed this year, I'm sure, from the later, well, those of us in this room, from the latest adaptation of J.K. Rowling's Cormoran Strike books to the upcoming Gavin and Stacey Christmas special, which I know will be on in my family's house. It provides fearless news coverage in our neighbourhoods, in Westminster and abroad, and it invests in creative talent. Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. On your point about regional news coverage, we have some excellent regional news coverage in my area, BBC Three Counties Radio, Look East as well. However, back in 2022, a decision was taken, which means that actually my regional politics programme is recorded over 100 miles away from my constituency. And given that all news is local, I wondered if my honourable friend would care to comment on whether he thought this was the right starting point in terms of regional news coverage, or whether when thinking about the future funding of the BBC, we might want to be doing something more local and perhaps better too. Thanks.
I thank my friend, my honourable friend, for their intervention. I agree that it's a shame that we've seen some regional political programming and news programming filmed further away than it was before. But I'm of course not able to answer directly for those decisions by the BBC. But the 30% funding decrease that I've outlined already, I think perhaps explains some of the reasoning behind that, and it's a shame we find ourselves there, and I think underlines the importance of finding a funding settlement and funding model that allows regional programming, truly local programming, to be safeguarded as best as possible, and underlines, as I say, the need for that. So, as I was saying, it provides fearless coverage in our neighbourhoods, sometimes a little further away than previously, in Westminster and abroad, and it invests in creative talent and programming across every corner of our great country. I think that's something worth fighting for and worth keeping in a world of media fragmentation, and I hope all colleagues will join in supporting a future funding model that ensures it lasts for another century. Thank you.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Serve under your chairmanship, and thank you to the right honourable member for Maldon for securing this very important debate and for his thoughtful comments. Just to make colleagues aware, I'm the co-chair of the National Union of Journalists Parliamentary group, and the BBC has frankly been at the heart of the UK's national life for over 100 years, and it's at the heart of my own constituency in Salford. Its mission to inform, educate and entertain is underpinned by its funding model, ensuring that it's universal, independent and never at the whim of vested business interests or advertisers. It's essentially there for the people of Britain, not for profit. And as well as entertaining us, more important than that, it reaches out to every community in the UK and gives them a voice. It's an intrinsic part of political accountability, holding local and national politicians to account, and it strives to provide content in the public interest, not just sensational headlines that offer the best clickbait. And everything from educational resources relied upon in our schools are produced by the BBC, to fact-checking services that cut through misinformation, to local radio and local democracy journalism. It's clear that the impact the BBC has on our communities is profound. Yes. Me that the BBC's unique currency is trust, and one of the challenges in recent years is that people have lost faith in the BBC as an organisation that produces impartial news. And one of the challenges I saw in the last Parliament was that they were reducing local journalism and regional journalism, even while protecting some very large salaries for its biggest stars. And that's one of the reasons why people are losing faith, that they're not investing in journalism in the way in which they should and what people expect from a public service broadcaster. I very much agree with the Honourable Lady regarding the cuts to local journalism particularly, because I think that they're a fundamental part of holding politicians and local democratic organisations to account, and it's incredibly worrying to see cuts to those local services both in print, in television and in radio, and hopefully that's something that the upcoming Charter Review will address and recognise. And I think there's a few points later in my speech in terms of accountability and rebuilding public trust overall for those who may have lost any element of trust. I think it's also important to recognise the BB's impact upon the rest of the world and how the world views the UK through its world service provision, most importantly at a time of great turmoil in certain parts of the world. The BBC World Service has a history of responding to emergency situations globally. Most recently in November, they launched an emergency radio service for Gaza, which remains on air. And in May 2023, during the conflict in Sudan, BBC News Arabic began an emergency radio service. In February 2022, the BBC News Ukraine service extended TV bulletins following the invasion of the country. And BBC News has also responded to the events in Syria with special programming across the week. But despite the crucial public interest role the BBC plays, as we've heard, it's seen a 30% real terms decrease in funding for UK public services in the last decade. Parts of the service have been at risk or cut completely, which puts the unique role of the BBC in jeopardy. Most recently, we've heard the cutting of hard talk and local radio service provision, to name but a few. So the forthcoming Charter review process provides us with the opportunity to put the BBC on a stable and sustainable footing. Recognising its vital role in our society and democracy, its significance as a major driver of the UK's wider creative economy, and its strategic value as a global asset. And I think it's important that we are discussing the importance of recognising the various funding options that are available beyond the licence fee. For example, the World Service is just one element of BBC provision that should be recognised on a department level, not just in terms of the licence fee. But of course, there are ways that we could improve the BBC too, particularly in how it engages with the public. The NUJ, for example, suggests that by starting with genuine engagement and consultation with the public about what they value from their BBC, it will regain their input into its future funding and direction. They further suggest public and staff representation on the BBC board, improving diversity and reflecting the priorities of licence fee payers more fully. They call for the reversal of initiatives that have diverted licence fee income away from core work, including the cost of free licences for the over 75s, which should be funded directly by the government. And they call for greater independence and safeguarding the BBC from perceived political interference, including BBC boards and its chair to be chosen by an arm's-length body. Also important is seeking to ensure the BBC better reflects the community it serves, both in its content but also in its staffing. And it could do this by piloting innovative initiatives to improve local news provision in communities that represent news deserts or near news deserts, opening up access to journalism with targeted training programmes to increase opportunity, including apprenticeships for school leavers, and building and protecting the spectrum of news provision across linear and digital platforms, including the proper resourcing of local radio news and local radio, ensuring a breadth of diverse content that prioritises quality. So I hope the Minister will consider some of these points carefully and continue to champion the BBC, both in Salford and across the UK. Because in a growing era of disinformation and growing political bias in the media sphere, fiercely protecting the values of public service broadcasting and its unique role in the provision of impartial, trustworthy news and journalism is crucial.
Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Mr Maldon. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I commend the Right Honourable Member for Maldon for securing this important debate. It was very good to hear his support for public service broadcasting and his recognition that the licence fee isn't just there for live television, but for many of the services that Honourable Members have already mentioned so far in this debate. I want to start off by saying why I strongly feel that we need the BBC and why it delivers such great value. And it still does so many things that the proliferation of streaming platforms do not. From a UK cultural and economic benefit perspective, the BBC provides a critical role in education, not just for children's programming, but of course the ever-informative and breathtaking nature documentaries from David Attenborough and others. Even in recent times, Line of Duty, even in this age of streaming, managed to secure 13 million viewers per night, and many of us were gripped looking forward to the next episode. It's brought us fantastic foreign language content to BBC 4, including the iconic The Killing, which astonished people with a foreign language subtitled programme hitting 1 million viewers a week. And those of us who were alive, albeit somewhat younger, in the 1990s, could always look forward to the thrill of Star Trek The Next Generation at 6 p.m. every Wednesday. For all of these reasons, a KPMG report estimates that for every £1 of economic activity generated by the BBC, £2.63 of wider economic value is created. Of course, it's so much more than entertainment. The value of fact-based and impartial reporting, analysis and investigation, particularly in this age of social media misinformation and us all being trapped in our thought bubbles, is essential. We need the forensic interviews on Radio 4's Today programme. We desperately need the local political reporting and scrutiny of services like BBC Oxford and BBC South. And we need the investigative journalism, domestic and international, that can be found across Radio 4. And as the Honourable Member for Leeds North East said, BBC World Service plays a key role in maintaining access to free and accurate sources of information in many repressive countries around the world, or countries facing humanitarian challenges, as he referenced in terms of Syria. Of course, we should recognise that the BBC is not perfect. The salaries of top presenters can be very high indeed, and scandals and crises have not always been prevented or well managed. But what other organisation would create and broadcast a documentary looking critically at its own failings and weaknesses, which was David Dimbleby's Days That Shook the BBC? The value for money of current funding and potential future reforms is important. But again, 95% of adults still use the BBC at least once a month. The alternative funding models explored to date do not necessarily create a fairer system without disadvantages. And that's why I think it is important for the government to be very clear on what are our desired outcomes from the BBC and public service broadcasting, and then work out from that how we fund them. And of course, we should consider ways to spread the TV licence cost more equitably, taking into account people in low incomes. But we need the quality, independence and breadth of the BBC now more than ever, and that is too important to risk losing through suboptimal or over-complex funding routes. So I'm pleased to see that the government is looking hard at how to sustain the BBC's future.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell. Apologies for the slight delay in preparing my comments. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank the member for Maldon firstly for bringing this debate to the House today. It's the 18th of December today, so this time next week, millions of people will be gathered around their television to watch Christmas Day programming. Millions will be preparing, it's 3:01. Millions will be watching the King's speech this time next week. And millions will be watching that on the BBC. People will not be subscribing to the BBC to watch the King's speech. People would subscribe to the BBC on Christmas Day for things like Gavin and Stacey, or EastEnders, or Doctor Who. And because they would only subscribe for entertainment purposes, they would be missing out on the cultural life of the country, on important issues that people should be exposed to and should consume. A subscription service that unwittingly creates such a taxonomy of programming, unwittingly divides content between public sector broadcasting on the one hand and entertainment on the other, would fall foul of reducing that sort of content consumption that is so important. I think the best way to ensure that the BBC continues to provide the services that it does provide is through the continuation and the maintenance of the licence fee model, rather than general taxation for public sector broadcasting or subscription services for entertainment. Of course.
With the except that whether you're a supporter or not of the licence fee, fewer people are choosing to pay it. So we have a problem that needs to be dealt with, regardless of whatever one's view is on the licence fee in its future.
Thank you for your question. Fewer people are willing to pay it, but there is a way around this. The efficiency savings that the BBC can make will help to rebuild trust in the BBC. I think that if the BBC's content can be improved, if the BBC's reach can be extended, that will lead to a regain of trust that the Honourable Lady mentioned earlier and will lead to more people supporting the BBC financially through the licence fee. I want to come on to an issue that the BBC has struggled with in recent years, which again is trust. BBC Verify is a new service that's been brought forward to try to combat the disinformation that we're seeing online. I've raised directly with BBC executives that BBC Verify can be improved, both in terms of content and tonally. I've raised that it's not perfect, but it is a good start in combating the disinformation and the misinformation that we see online. I hope that more effort can be put into improving Verify's output in the months and the years to come. I want to come on to the importance of the World Service, which has been discussed in the last half hour by many members. I'm supportive of the government's recent uplift in funding for the World Service, but I want to make it clear that I favour the return of funding for the World Service to the Foreign Office. That would relieve financial pressures on the BBC's domestic coverage. That would enable sustainability and stability into the long term, and it would help to support Britain's soft power role in an increasingly dangerous world. I'll move on to the BBC's cultural impact. The BBC's cultural impact is crucial to supporting the creative economy in the UK. BBC strives to represent and serve all communities across the UK, investing over half of its funding outside of London. The creative sector is a continually developing area in the country, and the BBC's £5 billion of investment a year supports a unique output to entertain and provides world-class exports for viewers abroad. I would like to see the BBC able to invest more in its cultural output in order to extend its provision in this area. For these reasons, I think it's incredibly important to maintain the BBC's position at the top of the electronic programme guides to make sure that public service broadcasting continues and survives in the years to come. Lastly, I will say that whilst the government should monitor the situation around the BBC's funding, I find that the current system of charter renewal, whereby the BBC diverts attention and resources on an almost continual basis to the upcoming charter review, I find that it's less effective than it should be at supporting the BBC to deliver as a public service. And therefore I would ask that the system should be changed to allow a permanent charter for the BBC, that the government and the BBC in concert can work to alter and change as and when required, rather than after a mandated medium-term period. So I welcome the government's commitment to getting the BBC on a stable financial footing, and I look forward to the Minister's comments later. Thank you, sir.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, my first time serving under a fellow Scottish MP. And I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Maldon, for securing this important debate and also for his learned contribution. And I declare an interest here as an office bearer on the APPG for the BBC and as the husband of a journalist and a former BBC employee. I'm not going to gild the lily on the contributions that so many learned members have already made. I'm going to give a very personal view. But of course, nothing is free. And when we consider the new model, we need to remember that, and my remarks will address that very point. More than most, perhaps, along with at least one other person in the room, I know the value of the BBC because I lived, studied and worked for 30 years in a society riven by conflict, division and hatred, at times verging on civil war. It was vital during those times to have faith in an organisation that provided reliable and trustworthy news and unbiased current affairs coverage. For the most part, the BBC fulfilled that function, both in their television and radio coverage, and for that I pay tribute to their courageous and award-winning broadcast journalism. The need for this role in an ever more divided society is all the greater. Throughout my life, I've been a fan of much of their output, and now I find myself in a position where instead of being simply a viewer or a listener, I occasionally find myself as a contributor, as an MP. I wish to place on record my admiration for the work that they do, often in challenging circumstances and environments. I believe they continue to be faithful to their commitment to inform, to educate and to entertain. They continue to enjoy a high level of trust and confidence, not only in these islands but across the world. Alas, there are also challenges. Too many to list in one speech today, but I want to put down a few markers here in this debate as each of them relates to any future consideration of the licence fee system and ultimately the Charter renewal. Firstly, especially in Scotland, but perhaps further afield, and my right honourable friends already referred to this, there is a widespread and growing perception that editorial policy is not always fair or impartial. For example, on too many occasions, audience members in political debates are not whom they purport to be, i.e. ordinary members of the public. On other occasions, contributors are not properly introduced in terms of their political perspective. On one recent occasion, a so-called independent commentator turned out to be a fully paid-up member of a political party. Nor do these feelings always result in public remedy or apology. As Elton John famously said, sorry seems to be the hardest word. There is a problem here for programme editors, not necessarily presenters. It is a vital component in retaining that trust and confidence that I spoke of earlier, and it is not good enough to simply wring the hands and say everyone complains equally. I don't believe that is true. Secondly, and it's obviously a very personal view, I do not think that it is only politicians who should not be double jobbing. I think it extends to the so-called talent within the BBC. Too many times we see high-profile individuals turning up as hosts on a wide variety of programmes. There are enormous salaries offered as justification for this triple and quadruple job holding. I believe the BBC should recognise that they have a responsibility to bring forward up-and-coming journalistic and other qualified talent from the wide range of local broadcasters whose careers are currently being effectively blocked or even blighted as a result of this. A final marker, Mr. Chairman, is in relation to the growing number of instances regarding unacceptable or illegal behaviour by BBC employees or by agents working on their behalf through subcontracting. This is often sexual harassment or worse of female colleagues or guests. I spoke about this recently on a BBC programme. I don't think it is good enough to divert responsibility to external production companies. The BBC needs to own this, to commit to an urgent internal review of their policies and a renewed training programme, especially for the so-called talent, where so often the problem lies and where managers have been reluctant to act. This is a cultural problem and it must be addressed at every level. I personally would wish to see a commitment to no training, no screen time. Very simple. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to an informed debate on the licence fee system, including a deep dive into potential alternatives to the licence fee, including, for example, consideration of opt-out advertising models, as we already see in the marketplace, perhaps of a pay-per-view system, and certainly a funding model which provides a much more socially just system in which the vulnerable, the elderly and those in poverty pay much less than the current licence fee. This is a changing world, Mr. Chairman, and the BBC must change with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maldon, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. So I too would like to speak up for the BBC World Service and for the brilliant people who work at the BBC World Service. So the World Service describes itself as the world's radio station, and I think that's right. And I think we're lucky to have it, and we must do whatever we can to support it. 42 languages services, and a beacon for democracy around the world. I think we do know the truth when we hear it from the BBC. In a world of endless rolling information and disinformation, it is surely significant that the Arabic service alone saw a 9% growth to 35 million a week just last year. We all know that there are places in the world, especially when internet connections are restricted and local journalists are fearful, where conventional radio remains crucial. Abuse and state malfunction are called out and the powerful are held to account. 318 million listeners every week. In 2022, World Service announced 382 job losses and the complete loss of the Persian radio broadcast. The Persian radio broadcast, which was so important in its coverage of the protests against the government in Tehran. And in Lebanon, Russian state-backed media is now using the frequency suspended by BBC Arabic. There is news, and there is fake news, as we have all learned. So whilst we debate the funding of the BBC, please let's remember the World Service, which Kofi Annan described as Britain's great gift to the world. Presently, about 3/4 of World Service funding is from the licence fee, and about 1/4, about £100 million, from the Foreign Office. Now, previously in this Parliament, I said this was about the same as an F-35 jet. We have 75 or so of them, and I asked the question whether some of us might agree that the vital soft power of the World Service was equivalent of at least one of our jets. Thank
you. What a pleasure it is to serve under your chairship, and can I thank the Right Honourable and learned colleague from Maldon for setting the scene so very well. I want to say make a few points, positive points, and then I want to probably outline what some of my constituents are telling me in relation to bias, and I want to have it on record, so I'll make those comments in a few minutes. But first of all, as the Right Honourable Member to my left-hand side referred, this time next week, the King's speech will just be over. And the nation as a whole will be sitting watching that, because it's one of the good things that the BBC do, and they do it well. I'll probably also be a fan, because my age gives it away, of the two Ronnies and Morecambe and Wise. Wow, what humour. An old-fashioned humour, by the way, but one that I was brought up with. I could tell some of the stories, but I won't, because you'll be here all day telling jokes. But their humour is incredible. I'm also endorse the excellent World Service that they do, and the fact that it does need to be upgraded and enhanced. But now I wish to shine a light on the elephant in the room. The BBC has long prided itself as a national broadcaster funded by the public and mandated to serve the public interest. Yet, my constituents tell me that the BBC's bias. Time and again we see a pattern of behaviour that alienates a significant portion of that very public. The BBC is no longer viewed, Mr Chairman, as the impartial institution it once claimed to be. I'm going to give 3 or 4 examples, if I can, just to have them on record. Ones that have been proven. I'm not making it up. I don't do those sort of things. Rather, has adopted a tone and an editorial stance that all too often aligns with a narrow view. Now, whether or not you're in favour of Brexit or not, let's just look at that one. Many of us in this House and across the country remember how the BBC approached Brexit. It wasn't with curiosity or indeed neutrality, as the public rightly deserved, but it was with scepticism and outright hostility. They weren't reporting the news, they were trying to shape the news. The same bias is extended to issues affecting Northern Ireland. The BBC cannot even name our country correctly, referring to their correspondent as an Ireland correspondent. My honourable friend, the right-hand side, will know how absurd and how wrong they got that, because the fact is, it's the Northern Ireland correspondent. Those who understand the constitution of Northern Ireland will understand it's part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Yet no, the BBC couldn't get it right. If it had been a Welsh reporter, it can't be Welsh correspondent, Scottish reporters can be Scottish correspondent. Northern Ireland deserves no less, Mr Chairman. So bias is not a matter of perception, it has tangible consequences. So public trust in the BBC has eroded, and I have to say this, it's no longer the broadcaster it once heralded it to be. Now, my politics, as the members on that side will know, my politics lies to the left. Probably a fair bit to the left, I suspect, but it doesn't take away from where I am. So I ask this question, and I'd say the Honourable Member of Clacton faced a hostile audience on Question Time, or Dame Andrea Jenkins, a former Conservative MP, was booed before she had even opened her mouth. And have I got news for you? My goodness. You know, that is not organic debate. It's a bias in practice. The BBC, honourable gentleman referred to it, I'm going to quote him. The BBC selects its audiences, sets the tone, consistently marginalises voices on the right of politics. I'm not in the right of politics. I never will be. But I make that point to have it right on record for those who have a different opinion. I respect other people's opinion, by the way, even though I may not agree with it, because that's the person I am. I hope others are the same. Happy to get that.
I would agree that this actually gets to the nub of the challenge. The BBC has a unique social contract with the public. It has the licence fee because people trust the BBC to produce high quality, impartial, trusted content. That's precisely the reason we have the BBC. And so if there's a sense from the public that that trust is being lost, that goes to the fundamental challenge to the BBC's very future. And if I may add, with Russia and China putting ever more money into their own state broadcasters, this represents a much wider challenge than just one for us here in the UK.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady very much for her intervention? She's absolutely right, and she's highlighted an issue which I wish to do as well. The Honourable Lady has done it better than I could. I put it in the record, and I look forward to the Minister's response. I should have welcomed the Minister to her place, by the way. She did her first adjournment debate last night and did extremely well, Mr Chairman, and today I know that she'll be exceptionally good when it comes to answering all the questions we're going to pose as well. The BBC's funding model must also be examined. The licence fee is compulsory, paid for by households across the United Kingdom, regardless of whether they feel the BBC reflects their values or indeed or serves their interests. I'm going to make this point for the record, Mr Chairman, when it comes to cultural programming. It's not a secret, I'm an Ulster Scot. I'm very proud of my history, the fact that my ancestors came from the lowlands of Scotland and came to Northern Ireland. That makes me an Ulster Scot. So when I look at this, my honourable friend as my brother, Gaelic brother, and there are probably others across the way who are similar. And if we go back far enough in our history, we'll find what we have at. But here's the question I want to make. The Ulster Scots Heritage Programmes risk being squeezed out in the culture programme that the BBC have. For the record, I think it's disgraceful. BBC should focus on delivering programming that matters to all parts of the United Kingdom. Instead, we see money poured into political agendas and overpaid presenters, while those cherished cultural significant programmes receive less attention. One example, Mr Chairman, and that's the BBC's bias clear in its coverage of Israel and Hamas. My goodness, just cast your mind back to all that. It's no secret I'm pro-Israel, but I believe in decency and justice for everyone in the Middle East, and that's where I come from. The refusal to describe Hamas as a terrorist organisation, they're murderers, they're rapists, and they're baby killers. That's who they are. That's the Hamas that we know. And yet the BBC couldn't bring themselves to call them what they were, terrorists. That undermines the BBC's credibility as a news source. What message does that send to the victims of terrorism? I'm quite happy.
Thank you. I apologise. I forget the constituency. I apologise. Just on the issue of trust, as he goes on to the issue of the subscription fee or the licence fee as such. And I must refer to my register of interest as someone who was supported by the Musicians' Union and the son of a videotape editor for the BBC, so I spent much of my childhood on the cutting floor of Pebble Mill in the West Midlands. However, I must say that the issue of bias is an issue we hear from all political parties and from all sides. I heard from my Liberal Democrat colleagues earlier today about their frustration that the leader of the Reform Party has appeared on the BBC far more times than any Liberal Democrats have. I hear from the Honourable Member, the full Minister, about her concern about trust. But then several high-profile leaders of the BBC are former Conservative members or advisors. On my local council, many of the people who work for the BBC are now prominent Conservatives. So we are talking about the funding of the BBC. We will never all not be happy with the output of the BBC at some stage, yet the public still put it higher than most news outlets and other broadcasters. But about the issue of funding this organisation that still is one of the best in the world, on the issue of subscriptions, if we put a subscription, would you not agree with me, if we put a subscription process in place, not everybody will take it up, which will drive the costs up of the subscription fee in the first place, and then the BBC will have an even bigger problem on funding moving forward.
Mr Chairman, thank you, and I thank the honourable member for that. And he's right to put forward a point of view, but you know that I didn't speak on behalf of the Reform Party because they're not my party. But the point I was making, if it's wrong that someone has been derided on TV because they happen to represent a political view, I think that's wrong. And that's the point I'm making in relation to it. And to take at that stage I just mentioned about Israel and Hamas, there was a supreme example of where the BBC bias carried over in such a way it couldn't even name them what they were. The Hamas terrorists and murderers, they're the people who hide behind women's skirts and children whenever they carry out their atrocities. So that's the organisation, and I'm expecting them to present the news in the way that it is. I understand I may be going on. So the question is how do we justify the licence fee? It must uphold its obligation to impartiality, fairness and transparency. Some would see the BBC as a left-wing bias. A compulsory licence fee cannot be justified when a large section of the public feels misrepresented, ignored or worse, derided. I conclude with this. We must demand that the BBC prioritises the voices and programming that matter to all parts of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Just for the BBC one, it doesn't know where Northern Ireland is. That means Ulster Scots programming given the platform it deserves. That means coverage of Northern Ireland that reflects the reality of our place within this great United Kingdom, which I'm proud to be a member of. And I'm always saying that all the time. BBC has faced calls for defunding. I can say it can either reclaim its role as a trusted and impartial broadcaster that unites the nation, or continue down its current path, which I've illustrated, alienating viewers, losing its purpose. The public has noticed the bias, Parliament has noticed the bias, BBC must now acknowledge the bias and act to restore trust. Thank you so much.
We now come to Lib Dem spokesperson Liz Jarvis.
Thank you, Chair. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I am grateful to the honourable member for Maldon for the opportunity to discuss the future funding of one of our nation's most cherished institutions. The BBC has been at the heart of our national life for over 100 years, embodying a mission that is simple yet profoundly important: to inform, educate and entertain. The BBC is not just another broadcaster. It plays a vital role in our cultural life and our national identity. It is universal, independent and unparalleled in its reach and influence, and it remains the most trusted broadcaster in the world. From BBC Bite-Size, which has educated millions of children, to the drama, music and comedy that enriches our lives, the BBC has no equal. Unlike global streaming services, which are motivated by profit and primarily serve international markets, the BBC exists to benefit the UK public. Public service broadcasting ensures content is produced for everyone, regardless of wealth or geography. It brings us together, whether it's to watch the coronation, follow the Olympics or enjoy the sounds of Glastonbury, or tune into local radio to hear about issues in our communities. A Netflix-style subscription model would be divisive and exclusionary. It would force the BBC to focus on content that attracts paying subscribers, sidelining the universal services that make it so valuable. These are services that serve all audiences, not just those who can afford to pay. A subscription model will drive up costs for consumers and reduce the money available for content investment. The notion that the BBC's entertainment content should be put behind a paywall is misguided. For many households, including the digitally excluded, this would make the BBC services inaccessible. It would also result in the loss of free access to well-loved shows including Strictly Come Dancing, Match of the Day, The Traitors and world-renowned drama. This proposal also ignores the reality of subscription-based financial models. Since its launch in the UK in 2012, when it charged £5.99 per month, Netflix's standard plan has increased to £10.99 per month and its premium plan to £17.99, representing an increase of 83% and 200% respectively. Now, consider the impact on a young person from a low-income household who might discover a passion for science through a BBC documentary or be inspired to pursue their dreams by a BBC film. These transformative experiences would be lost if access were restricted to only those who could afford to pay. An advertising-funded BBC would be equally damaging. It would siphon advertising revenue away from commercial broadcasters, weakening the entire UK media ecosystem. Worse still, it would compromise the BBC's independence by exposing it to commercial pressures. This would push the BBC to prioritise more generic mass appeal programming over distinctive high-quality British productions. It would also undermine the BBC's ability to deliver the rich, global and multicultural programming that has become its hallmark. The BBC's current funding model guarantees universality and independence. For just over £3 a week, households gain access to a treasure trove of content, including 9 TV channels, 39 local radio stations, and online services such as BBC iPlayer and BBC Sounds. And yet the BBC has faced a 30% real-time funding cut over the last decade, forcing tough decisions and service reductions. We cannot continue with perpetual uncertainty about the status of the BBC. The BBC's current charter ensures the licence fee model until at least 2027, but beyond that, we must commit to a funding model that is sustainable, fair and fit for the future. Part of that future must include stronger support for the BBC World Service. This unparalleled institution is not only a vital source of impartial news for 450 million people globally, but also a key pillar of the UK's soft power. Whether it's exposing corruption, raising awareness of public health challenges, or championing education and human rights, the BBC World Service is not just projecting British values, it is doing real good in the world. However, recent funding cuts forced the closure of language services. This is unacceptable. We must restore full funding to the World Service through the Foreign Office budget, allowing it to continue its invaluable work. The BBC is also a driver of the UK's creative economy, contributing nearly £5 billion annually. It commissions more independent productions than any other broadcaster, invests in research and development and supports apprenticeships and training. At its heart, the BBC's mission is to act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high-quality and distinctive output. In a media landscape dominated by billionaires seeking to engineer narratives that align with their personal interests and agendas, the BBC stands as one of the few institutions committed to impartiality and serving the public. I will give way.
Thank you very much. We've heard, not just here today, but over the years, accusations of political bias. And, I will have friends on the left who accuse the BBC of being biased against them, and family members on the right, who I'm sure I'll have conversations with over Christmas making the same comments. Do you think if both sides, and indeed I'm sure the middle, have complaints about it, perhaps the BBC are getting something right?
I do agree with my honourable friend. But I'd like to ask the Minister if she will agree with me that the BBC's funding model must not be a Trojan horse for those who seek to undermine its editorial independence and pave the way for figures such as Elon Musk, whom we have little opportunity to scrutinise or hold to account. Liberal Democrats are committed to a strong, independent and well-funded BBC that continues to reflect the diversity of our nation and serves all audiences. I will give way.
Grateful. I don't disagree with a lot of what she's said about the value of the BBC, but the problem is that more and more people are unwilling to pay the licence fee, and that has to be addressed. She wants to see a strongly financed and funded BBC, but she is going to have to come up with an answer to the fact that the revenue is going to go on declining under the present model.
I thank my honourable friend, and I don't disagree that there does need to be a plan, but at the moment I don't see one on the table. The next charter review is the time to have a serious evidence-based discussion about funding, but any changes must strengthen, not diminish the BBC. Through the BBC, we see things about our nation and the world we might never encounter in our own lives. As Sir David Attenborough has said, the world would be worse off without our stories. It must be taken with great pride that the British public has a direct role in providing the platform needed to nurture and share the genius of so many British individuals in the creative industry. I hope we can continue to protect public ownership of the BBC, to preserve the voices and stories that make us who we are.
Shadow Minister Barty.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And let me start by, first of all, wishing all members and you, Mr Mundell, a very Merry Christmas. And can I also thank my honourable friend from Maldon for bringing this valuable debate. And it has been a spirited debate with some very interesting points. I'll try and certainly pose some questions to the Minister, and as it's Christmas, in the most constructive way I can. For the vast majority of people in the country, the BBC plays a fundamental role in our lives, and the scope of the BBC is impossible to estimate. The National Union of Journalists estimate that 91% of British adults use the BBC. They use BBC television, radio, or even online each week, and its global reach is equally important, as has already been pointed out by a number of members. 426 million people access the BBC every week via the World Service, worldwide and global news. The BBC's reach and reputation is a source of pride for people in the UK, quite rightly. However, as has been pointed out by my right honourable friend from Maldon, as we approach the renewal of the BBC's Royal Charter in 2027, there is no denying that the government must recognise some of the challenges that the organisation faces, not least its sustainability, with decreasing licence fee uptake and decreasing revenues. I'm going to next address the issue of trust, which has also been brought up, because the social contract that exists between the licence fee payer and the BBC is absolutely fundamental. And unless we ensure that people have faith in the BBC and its role in society, endless questions about its relevance and importance will continue to be a factor in public discourse, and failure to address that issue will undermine trust in the BBC. The BBC is one of our great institutions, and since its founding, it has promoted the very best of Britain at home and abroad. It has guided our nation through war, economic and political crises, and much, much more. It needs to be trusted, especially as we see our adversaries, like Russia and China, bolstering their own the reach of their own state broadcasters. And of course, we are seeing the concerning impact of AI and misinformation domestically and across the world. And we have to emphasise the issue of trust, which is it's clearly a trend that we are seeing about the questioning of the BBC's credibility, as pointed out by my right honourable friend, the member for Hornchurch and Upminster, who was, I know, an excellent minister, as was my right honourable friend for Maldon in these issues. Recent funding figures are a cause for concern. The 2015 DCMS Select Committee report found that some view the licence fee as anachronistic and harder to sustain, and its conclusions are verified by the fact that licence fee income between 2023 and 2024 and 2022 and 2023 is down, and there are fewer licences in force at the end of March 2024 than were at the end of 2023. It clearly suggests that more people are reluctant to pay the licence fee because they are not believing in it and they are not trusting the BBC. This is a foundational challenge for the government. This country needs the BBC, and the challenge is for the government and the BBC to make the case why that is the case. And I hope the Minister will recognise that in her closing remarks. We must also recognise that the way that people engage with media, especially our younger generations, how they engage with media has altered dramatically in the past decade. The COVID pandemic accelerated some of these trends, which have dramatically transformed the media landscape, which led to a surge in online streaming companies, which now dominate the market. So, as we approach the review of the Royal Charter, we cannot ignore the radically different media environment that the BBC is operating in and competing in than they were just 10 years ago. And the government must understand that unless there is genuine reform of the BBC and how it functions, it will continue to be an analogue service in a digital world. There's no denying that the licence fee model was conceived at a time of linear viewing, where watching programmes at the time of broadcast were commonplace. The reality is much different now. The BBC competes in a far more crowded market, a market that can be accessed anytime and anywhere. Licence fee payments will not increase if the BBC does not continue to strive to adapt with the rapid way and the rapid changes that we all are having to interact with media online. So I asked the Minister, what discussions is she having with the BBC to ensure its funding remains sustainable over the next 10 years in light of a radically different media landscape? And I'd like to say this, Mr Mundell, I acknowledge that these are not easy questions. They require leadership and clarity, so I hope the Minister can provide some of that in her remarks. The issue of local radio has also been brought up, and the government should also, I hope, seek to engage constructively with the BBC about the future of local radio. The BBC has 39 local radio stations that currently reach 5.7 million listeners. And in the terms of the current Royal Charter, the BBC has an obligation to reflect the diversity of the United Kingdom in both its output and its services, and that it meets the needs of its regions and communities. As the National Union of Journalists sets out, local radio is a lifeline for often isolated rural communities and provides an invaluable source of news and education for so many, especially elderly people in our communities. And at a time where elderly people are feeling more and more marginalised, it would be wrong to have further cuts to local radio, which provides essential information and entertainment for millions. And I thought my right honourable friend from Maldon made some excellent suggestions in this regard, and I certainly hope that the Minister will be able to address some of the concerns that he raised and the questions that he raised. I also want to just turn to Ofcom, because the question of BBC funding also raises other issues, and it's been raised in a number of different ways when it comes to impartiality of the BBC. But as Ofcom is the broadcasting regulator and has the role of responding to challenging broadcasters, especially in an ever more competitive environment, there is clearly some questions around this that certainly the public will want answers to. In the past decade, the BBC has had many new competitors, and the issue I wanted to just raise was of GB News, where Ofcom recently fined GB News for £100,000 for their programme with the former Prime Minister in February of this year. And there were many people who believed that that was not correct. I also raised that question, and I do believe that the government should question Ofcom's remit in the scope of these discussions and the scope that they have to deny freedom of speech, and whether their fines are proportionate under the circumstances as we enter an ever more competitive media landscape, which is fundamentally different compared to the previous decade. Mr Chairman, as I sit down, I just want to wish you Merry Christmas once more, and all honourable members for their contributions, and I hope they have a very happy New Year.
Minister Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Mundell, and I'd like to echo the Shadow Minister's Merry Christmas to everyone in Westminster Hall today. And I'd of course like to begin by congratulating the Right Honourable Member for Maldon on securing this important debate. We've had a lot of opportunities this week to debate the BBC together. I'd like to begin my remarks by responding to some of the points that by both my opposite number and other members have made. Well, firstly, the member for Maldon rightly pointed out that this is a good time to have this debate. He opened his remarks by talking about the importance of public service broadcasting and how important it is to us today. And of course we spent many hours debating the Media Bill, now Media Act, that goes to the heart of those issues, and of course now falls to this government to implement that act. A number of members, and I think the Shadow Minister included, as well as the member for Didcot and Wantage, pointed out how many people access the BBC, over 90% every month. But of course there are lots of important and challenging issues about BBC funding and also the Charter review. But I think it's been a really good debate for members to have rightly shared their own experiences and memories of the BBC. So the member for Southport, I think, was one who spoke about the shared experience as a country that we have, how the BBC brings us together. We'll be watching the King's Speech, and of course Gavin and Stacey a week today, or at least I will be. And members across the House have also rightly spoken about their passion and support for the World Service, in particular the member for Bury St Edmunds and the Right Honourable Member whose debate this is sits on the Select Committee, of which I was pleased to give evidence to. I'm really pleased that 3 Select Committees are taking such an interest. There's a lot of questions, challenges, but it's really important that we put on record our support for the World Service. The Shadow Minister asked a few questions around engagement with the BBC. The Secretary of State and the BBC and myself have met with the BBC and will continue to do so. He also asked some questions around local radio. It's of course important to state that BBC are operationally independent, but when I was in his place, I made my views very clear, as did the member for Westminster, who was the Minister at the time. So I'd like to speak now broadly about the BBC before going on to address some of the wider issues on funding. So for over 100 years, the BBC has been a cherished British asset, making a vital contribution to our national life. It supports our democracy, brings our communities together, and helps to shape and define our nation by telling the stories of people in all parts of the UK. The BBC has an almost unique role as a source of trusted news both in the UK and to millions of people across the globe, as well as being a provider of cutting-edge programming and educational content for the nation's children. It is so often the first to invest in skills, the physical assets and the creativity to boost the creative industries in all corners of the country. Of course, over the BBC's long history, the media environment has changed. Even since the start of the current charter period in 2017, as the government was bringing in iPlayer into scope of the licence fee, the market has significantly evolved, a point that's already been discussed in this debate. Now, of course, the Right Honourable Member for Maldon knows all this very well, not least because he served as Secretary of State for DCMS during the previous charter review. But the world is changing, and as he outlined in his speech, now for the first time, half of 16 to 24-year-olds do not watch broadcast TV on a weekly basis. We are seeing audiences increasingly turn to on-demand content, and more than two-thirds of households subscribe to streaming services compared to about a third at the start of the charter period. And of course, the Shadow Minister did ask about some of these challenges, and this does go to the heart of this debate, because as an institution, the BBC is often needed to adapt, renew and grapple with an ever-increasing pace of change. And that's something I think the member for Aberdeenshire North and Moray East spoke about in his contribution. So next year, the government will formally launch Charter Review with that need for adaptation in mind. We intend to use Charter Review not just to think through the operation of the BBC and how it thrives for the next 10 years, but well into the latter half of this century. And we know that any reform to the BBC, particularly when it comes to funding, could have a major impact on the whole sector. We'll consider that carefully as part of the Charter Review as well. We want to have a national conversation to make sure the BBC truly represents and delivers for every person in this country, wherever they come from and whatever their background. And this will include the opportunity for stakeholders and audiences across the country to respond to the Charter Review public consultation before the new Charter comes into effect in 2028. Our thinking will also be informed by my department's wider work, and we're undertaking a project on the future of TV distribution to analyse how people receive their television now and through the next decade. This will help us to ensure the continuity of a sustainable TV ecosystem and the best outcome for audiences. So as we address vital questions about the future form of the BBC head-on, we must also ensure there is a sustainable funding model that is fair for those that pay it. These are undoubtedly complex issues where people will hold strong opinions, but this government wants to have an open and honest discussion about them in the best interests of the public. We're fully committed to retaining the licence fee for the rest of this charter period, but we can't ignore the fact that challenges to this funding model in its current form are increasing, as has been highlighted in this debate today. The media market is more competitive than ever, with the emergence of streamers and social media platforms operating at a global scale. It's meant less money for the BBC to invest in our creative industries, in talent and skills, and in telling our stories. And it has resulted in cuts to BBC services, an area the member for Salford spoke about. Now, the Secretary of State has announced that we will take forward work on the BBC funding as part of the Charter Review process to bring together the linked issues of what the BBC does at its future role and how it is funded. The government is keeping an open mind about the future of the licence fee. Now, the Honourable Gentleman referenced the committee he chaired, and more recently the Culture, Media and Sports Committee 2021 report on the future of public service broadcasting found there are a range of options for funding the BBC, but none are perfect. Give way once and then twice.
The Secretary of State has talked about her support for mutualisation. It's never been clear to me what that actually means. Could she give us more details?
Well, I happily asked the Secretary of State to write to her, but I think in talking about mutualisation, you'll note that she made some comments about this some years ago, about having a greater role and accountability for the public in the BBC, about the public feeling more ownership. But I'll happily write to the Honourable Member with more detail. I don't want to speak on behalf of the Secretary of State. I'll give way again.
I thank the Minister very much for her response. Always very positive and very enthusiastic. I thank her for that. Last night in the adjournment debate, we referred to the Charter Review. And the Honourable Lady referred to the need for those of complaints and how that will be done by Ofcom or by other organisations. I just want to say this. Those people who come to me and those examples of bias that I referred to, Mr Chairman, they are some of the people who do not have and will not buy a BBC licence. If there's a better system within the BBC, where people who have complaints of bias or whatever they may be have their complaints done in a good way that is honest and transparent. I think that might draw some of those people back who have decided not to renew their licence. Would the Honourable Lady give us that assurance that would be what we would do? Thank you.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his contribution. Of course, we did speak about this in the debate last night, and there is that complaints procedure through BBC First, and obviously it can be escalated to the Executive Complaints Unit and then to Ofcom. But I do appreciate that some people have just simply decided not to buy a TV licence, and we do want to explore this issue of trust and confidence in the BBC as part of the Charter renewal process and the review, and there will, of course, be a public consultation of which his constituents and, of course, and mine and members from across the House can take part in. But we're not in the business of reform for reform's sake. We are going to think in the broadest sense about the options on the BBC's funding and structure, and nothing is off the table, as the Secretary of State said when she gave evidence to the Select Committee last week. It is clear there are limits to the amount of money the BBC can raise from commercial sources, particularly given its obligations as a public service broadcaster. We firmly believe that the unique obligations placed on the BBC demand continued sustainable public funding in support of its vital work. In the meantime, we must ensure the BBC is properly and fairly supported for the remainder of this charter, and that is why we announced we are increasing the annual cost of a TV licence from 2025 in April by £5 in line with CPI inflation, and this is less than half as much as last year's increase. For the BBC, this will deliver additional and proportionate funding, allowing them to continue to deliver world-class educational and engaging programme. We always take decisions on funding to provide certainty and stability for the BBC while ensuring those decisions deliver the best outcomes for licence fee payers. The Government has already noted the ongoing concerns about the impact of TV licensing enforcement action on vulnerable households. I'm acutely aware of the financial difficulties faced by some households, and we're committed to supporting them to spread the cost of a TV licence. We recently announced an expansion of the Simple Payment Plan to all unlicensed households facing financial hardship to help more people pay in flexible instalments rather than finding a greater amount of money up front. We will also look at enforcement issues as part of the longer-term funding work we take forward a charter review. Now, the provision of trustworthy local and national news is vital for democracy and holding elected representatives to account, especially at a time where mis- and disinformation is spreading at rapid speeds. Local journalism, in particular, also helps to foster community in areas like my own in Barnsley. By reporting on stories that matter to local people, the BBC helps people to feel connected to the place they call home. In the last few days alone, in my area, the BBC has reported on a new sculpture that will be placed on a roundabout in Goldthorpe, a local Christmas tree that will have had to be taken down due to the dangers related to wind and vandalism, and a new specialist care home being built in Barnsley. These kinds of varied local stories matter to local people, enriching their understanding of the issues affecting their neighbourhoods, and I know members from across the House will have similar stories to share. Ultimately, the BBC has a huge role to play in telling our country's story, creating great jobs and opportunities, and driving growth in the creative economy. We are determined to get the forthcoming Charter Review right to future-proof the BBC and ensure that we can all continue to enjoy and benefit from it for decades to come. The Right Honourable Member for Maldon has made an important contribution, not just today, but through his years of public service, and I thank him for that.
And now I call the Right Honourable Gentleman to wind up the debate.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. And can I begin by thanking all honourable members who have taken part in this afternoon's debate. I think although a number of criticisms of the BBC have been expressed, and I have my own criticisms, nevertheless everybody recognises the value that the BBC brings to the UK and our society, and the importance of trying to make sure that it does continue to play that very important role. But there is a problem that the current model is looking harder and harder to sustain, and therefore I suspect that this is an issue which we are going to be continuing to debate over the coming weeks and years during the Charter renewal process. So I look forward to returning and continuing my discussion with the Minister and all those others. And I would like to thank everybody for their contribution and to join my honourable friend from Front Bench and the Minister and all others in wishing all members a very happy Christmas.
Thank you. I'm surprised nobody's mentioned BBC Parliament, on which this debate will appear, and I understand that it is available over Christmas when it shows highlights from the parliamentary proceedings, of which I'm sure this will be part. The question is that this House has considered the future funding of the BBC. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. I suspend proceedings until 4 p.m.